The first droplets of rain began falling on Maple Street just as Karen Martinez stepped onto her pristine front porch, cell phone pressed against her ear like a weapon. Her manicured nails drummed against the white railing as she spoke in the saccharine tone that every neighbor within a 3-block radius had learned to fear. Yes, hello, this is Karen Martinez at 1247 Maple Street. I need to report another violation at the Rodriguez property next door. She paused, watching through her kitchen window as Miguel Rodriguez guided his 8-year-old daughter Sofia into their backyard pool. They're operating an illegal swimming facility without proper permits. The afternoon sun cast long shadows. Across the quiet suburban street, where American flags hung limp in the humid air and the scent of barbecue smoke drifted from backyards. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes on sidewalks and elderly couples walked there. Dogs at sunset, or at least, it had been before Karen Martinez moved in 3 years ago. We've received several calls about this property already, the city inspector's voice crackled through the phone. Our records show, your records are wrong. Karen's voice shot up an octave, causing Mrs. Chen across the street to look up from watering her roses. I've lived here for years, and I know every regulation in this neighborhood. That pool is a safety hazard and a code violation. Through the chain-link fence that separated their properties, Karen could see Miguel teaching Sofia how to float. On her back, the little girl's laughter carried on the warm breeze, mixing with the gentle splash of water. Miguel's wife Elena sat on the pool deck, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant with their second child. The sight made Karen's jaw clench. When she'd moved to Maple Street after her divorce, she'd envisioned a quiet, orderly neighborhood where property values remained stable and neighbors minded their own business. Instead, she'd found herself next door to what she considered chaos incarnate. Weekend barbecues that lasted past 9 p.m., children playing loudly in the yard, and now this, an above-ground pool that she was certain violated at least 17. Municipal codes. I'll need to schedule another inspection, the city employee said with barely concealed exhaustion. But I have to tell you, Mrs. Martinez, this will be the 4th time we've been out there in 2 months. Good. Do your job. Karen ended the call and immediately dialed another number. On the pool deck, Elena Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. In her chair, one hand supporting her lower back. She'd been watching Karen pace back and forth on her porch for the past 10 minutes, and the familiar knot of anxiety was forming in her stomach. Miguel, she called softly to her husband. She's on the phone again. Miguel looked over from where he was helping Sofia practice her kicks. At 34, he'd worked construction for 12 years, his hands bearing the calluses and scars of honest labor. When they'd saved enough money to buy the house on Maple Street, it had felt like achieving the American dream. The above-ground pool had been Sofia's birthday present, a modest 16-footer that brought more joy to their family than anything they'd ever purchased. Don't worry about her, mi amor, Miguel said, though his own expression had hardened. We have every right to be here. But Elena's worry was justified. In the 3 months since they'd installed the pool, Karen had filed complaints with the city, the homeowners association, and the health department. She'd accused them of everything from noise violations to creating a mosquito breeding ground. Each official visit had found no violations, but Karen's campaign showed no signs of slowing down. Papi, watch me. Sofia called out, preparing to jump from the pool's edge. I'm watching, Mija, Miguel replied, but his attention was divided between his daughter and the woman on the porch who seemed determined to make their lives miserable. Karen's next call was to the Homeowners Association president, Harold Whitfield, a retired bank manager who took his volunteer position with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. Harold, it's Karen. I need you to come take a look at the Rodriguez situation immediately. Karen, we've discussed this. Harold's voice carried the weight of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. The pool meets all HOA requirements. It's temporary, it's not permanently affixed to the property, and it's within the size restrictions. But what about the permit situation? I know they don't have the proper permits. For an above-ground pool of that size, no permit is required under city ordinance. Karen's grip tightened on her phone. This wasn't the answer she wanted to hear. For 20 years, she'd lived in her previous neighborhood, where she'd served as block captain and unofficial enforcer of community standards. Neighbors had learned to trim their hedges to her specifications and paint their shutters in approved colors. Moving to Maple Street was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to establish herself as a respected community leader. Instead, she'd found herself next door to people who seemed immune to her influence. There has to be something, Karen insisted. What about water drainage? Property line violations? Noise ordinances? Karen, Harold said with growing firmness, I strongly suggest you find a way to coexist with your neighbors. This level of scrutiny isn't healthy for anyone involved. The call ended, leaving Karen standing alone on her porch, her perfectly styled blonde hair beginning to frizz in the humidity. Through the fence, she could see Miguel lifting Sophia out of the pool, wrapping her in a bright pink towel printed with cartoon mermaids. The sight of their happiness felt like a personal affront. That evening, as the Rodriguez family gathered around their patio table for dinner, Karen retreated to her home office, a shrine to her previous life as a middle manager at an insurance company. Filing cabinets lined the walls, filled with meticulously organized documents, neighborhood bylaws, and correspondence with various municipal offices. She pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Rodriguez Violations and spread its contents across a desk. Photos of the pool taken from her second-story window. Printed emails with city officials. Copies of noise complaints she'd filed every time their guests stayed past 8 p.m. But buried beneath the recent documents was something else, a folder from her previous house, where she'd maintained her own above-ground pool for 7 years. Her fingers found the document she'd been looking for, her original pool permit application from 2003. A slow smile spread across Karen's face as she studied the yellowed paper. She'd kept meticulous records of everything, and this permit, though expired and from a different property, looked official enough to support her claims of expertise in pool regulations. Tomorrow, she would escalate this situation to a level that Miguel and Elena Rodriguez had never imagined. Across the fence, the Rodriguez family was settling in for the night. Elena had finally found a comfortable position on the couch, her feet elevated while Miguel read Sophia a bedtime story. The little girl's hair was still damp from the pool, smelling faintly of chlorine and sunscreen. Mommy, can we have a pool party for the new baby? Sophia asked, her dark eyes bright with excitement. Elena smiled, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. We'll see, mi amor. First, we need to make sure the baby arrives safely. But even as she spoke those words, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Karen Martinez was planning something that would threaten the peace they'd worked so hard to build. The woman's stare had grown more intense lately, and Elena had noticed her taking photos from her upstairs window. Miguel, she said quietly after Sophia had fallen asleep, maybe we should take down the pool for a while, just until after the baby comes. Miguel looked up from his laptop, where he'd been researching their rights as homeowners. Elena, we've done nothing wrong. Sophia loves that pool, and we followed every rule when we put it up. I know, but she's making our lives so difficult. All those phone calls, the complaints. If we give in now, she'll just find something else to target. Miguel's voice carried a determination that Elena both admired and feared. This is our home, our property. She doesn't get to dictate how we live. Outside, the summer night had settled over Maple Street, bringing with it the usual chorus of crickets and the distant hum of air conditioning units. But in her brightly lit office, Karen Martinez was wide awake, crafting emails to every city department she could think of, each one referencing her extensive experience with pool permits and regulations. She had no way of knowing that her crusade was about to collide with forces beyond her control, a city inspector having the worst day of his career, a social media video that would capture the attention of millions, and the kind of public humiliation that destroyed reputations in a matter of hours. The storm clouds gathering outside her window were nothing compared to the perfect storm of consequence heading her way, triggered by a single piece of paper that would expose 20 years of bullying, manipulation, and the kind of entitled behavior that had finally met its match. As the first drops of rain began to fall harder against her office window, Karen Martinez sealed her fate with a phone call that would change everything. Yes, I'd like to speak to someone about filing a formal complaint regarding illegal pool installation, she said into the phone, her voice filled with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the cards. She was about to learn that in the game of. The next morning arrived with the oppressive heat that only mid-July could deliver. By 7 a.m., the temperature had already climbed to 85 degrees, and the weather forecast promised another scorcher that would drive every sensible person indoors by noon. But Karen Martinez was already dressed in her armor of choice, a crisp white button-down shirt, pressed khaki slacks, and the kind of sensible flats that clicked authoritatively against pavement. She stood at her kitchen window, sipping coffee from a mug emblazoned with World's Best Manager, watching Miguel Rodriguez prepare for another day of construction work. His truck sat in the driveway, toolboxes secured in the bed, lunch cooler beside the driver's seat. A man who worked with his hands, she thought dismissively, as if honest labor was somehow beneath her notice. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Karen made her first call of the day. City Planning Department, this is Jennifer speaking. Jennifer, this is Karen Martinez. I spoke with someone yesterday about the illegal pool installation at 1245 Maple Street. I need to escalate this to a supervisor immediately. Let me pull up the file. The sound of typing filled the pause. I see we have multiple complaints filed by you regarding this address. Our inspector found no violations during his last 3 visits. Karen's grip tightened on the phone. Your inspector clearly doesn't understand pool regulations. I've been dealing with pool permits for over 20 years. I know what violations look like. What's your background in pool regulations, if I may ask? This was the moment Karen had been preparing for. She walked to her desk and picked up the 2003 permit, studying its official letterhead and embossed seal. I've maintained my own pool for decades. I understand permit requirements, safety codes, and property line restrictions better than most of your staff. I see. Well, if you'd like to file a formal complaint with documentation, you're welcome to come down to City Hall and meet with our supervisor. I'll be there within the hour. Karen ended the call with the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd just played a winning hand. She gathered her documents, including the 2003 permit that she was certain would establish her credibility, and headed for her silver Honda Civic. Across the fence, Elena Rodriguez was settling into a patio chair, with a cup of herbal tea, trying to find relief from the morning sickness that had returned with a vengeance. At 8 months pregnant, even the simplest tasks had become challenging, but she wanted to spend a few peaceful minutes by the pool before the day's heat became unbearable. The sound of Karen's car starting drew her attention, and Elena watched through the fence slats as a neighbor backed out of the driveway with unusual urgency. Something about Karen's determined expression sent a chill down Elena's spine despite the rising temperature. She's up to something, Elena murmured to herself, one hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby was beginning to stir. 20 minutes later, Karen Martinez strode through the glass doors of City Hall with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything they truly wanted. The building's air conditioning provided blessed relief from the heat, but Karen barely noticed as she approached the information desk. I need to speak with the supervisor of the planning department about a serious code violation. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s who had seen every type of complainant in her 15 years behind the desk, looked up with practiced patience. Do you have an appointment? This is urgent. I have documentation that proves your inspectors have been negligent in their duties. Something in Karen's tone must have conveyed the seriousness she felt, because 10 minutes later she found herself sitting across from David Chen, the planning department supervisor, in a small conference room lined with building codes and zoning maps. Mrs. Martinez, I understand you have concerns about a pool installation in your neighborhood. David Chen was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had learned that the most effective way to handle upset residents was to let them talk themselves out. It's not just concerns, it's a clear violation that your staff has repeatedly ignored. Karen spread her documents across the table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. I've been documenting multiple infractions, and I have the expertise to identify problems that your inspectors have missed. David glanced at the photos Karen had taken from her window, shots of the Rodriguez pool from every conceivable angle. What's your background in pool regulations? Karen slid the 2003 permit across the table. I've held pool permits for over 20 years. I understand the requirements better than most homeowners. David picked up the document, and Karen felt a surge of vindication as his expression grew more serious. This was the moment her credibility would be established, when her complaints would finally be taken with the gravity they deserved. This permit is from 2003, David said slowly. Exactly. I have extensive experience with the permit process. But this is for a different address, and it expired 20 years ago. Karen's confidence faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. The regulations haven't changed significantly. I know what constitutes a proper installation. David, Chen had been in municipal government long enough to recognize the type of person sitting across from him. The kind of resident who believed that owning property gave them authority over their neighbors' lives. The kind who weaponized city resources to wage personal vendettas. Mrs. Martinez, I've reviewed the inspection reports for the Rodriguez property. The pool meets all current codes. It's properly positioned, it's the appropriate size for a temporary installation, and it doesn't require a permit under our current ordinances. But what about drainage issues? Property line violations? I'm sure there's something. David interrupted gently but firmly. I'm going to be direct with you. This appears to be a personal dispute rather than a legitimate code violation. Our inspectors have found no problems with this installation, and continuing to file complaints without cause could be considered harassment. The word harassment hit Karen like a physical blow. No one had ever accused her of harassment before. She was a concerned citizen, a responsible neighbor, someone who cared about property values and community standards. I am not harassing anyone. I'm trying to protect my neighborhood from people who think rules don't apply to them. David Chen had heard this speech before, always delivered with the same righteous indignation. Mrs. Martinez, I strongly recommend that you try to resolve this matter directly with your neighbors. Our department considers this case closed unless new evidence of actual violations emerges. Karen left City Hall feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, complete rejection of her authority. The summer heat hit her like a wall as she stepped outside, but it was nothing compared to the burning humiliation of being dismissed by a government official who should have recognized her expertise. By the time she returned to Maple Street, her anger had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous than mere frustration. This was no longer about pool permits or property values. This was about respect, about establishing her rightful place in the neighborhood hierarchy. The Rodriguez house looked peaceful in the midday sun. Miguel's truck was gone, off to whatever construction site was paying his wages. Elena's car sat in the driveway, and Karen could see movement through the kitchen window where the pregnant woman was probably preparing lunch. Perfect. Karen marched directly to the Rodriguez front door and rang the bell with the persistence of a bill collector. When Elena answered, her face already showing the strain of dealing with her difficult neighbor, Karen didn't bother with pleasantries. I just came from City Hall, Karen announced, holding up her manila folder like evidence in a criminal trial. I've documented multiple violations of your pool installation, and I wanted to give you the courtesy of explaining the situation before I pursue legal action. Elena, 8 months pregnant and exhausted from a morning of dealing with persistent nausea, felt her patience snap. Mrs. Martinez, we've had 3 inspections. Our pool is legal. I don't know what else we can do to convince you. Your pool is a safety hazard and a code violation. I've been dealing with pool permits for over 20 years, and I know violations when I see them. Karen's voice was rising, carrying across the quiet street where several neighbors were beginning to take notice. Please lower your voice. You're scaring my daughter. I'll lower my voice when you take responsibility for the problems you've created in this neighborhood. At that moment, Sofia Rodriguez appeared beside her mother, having heard the commotion from the living room where she'd been coloring. The 8-year-old looked up at Karen with the wide-eyed confusion of a child who couldn't understand why the lady next door always seemed so angry. Mommy, why is she yelling? Sofia whispered in Spanish. The sight of the little girl speaking a language other than English seemed to trigger something primal in Karen's worldview. This is America, she snapped. Speak English in front of me. Elena's protective instincts flared like a wildfire. Excuse me. You heard me. If you want to live in this neighborhood, you need to respect American customs and American laws. The racist undertone of Karen's comment landed like a slap. Elena had been born in Texas, had grown up speaking both Spanish and English, had worked as a bilingual teacher before Sofia was born. Karen Martinez woke up at 6:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. In her groggy state, she assumed it was another robocall and let it go to voicemail. The second call came 30 seconds later. Then a third. By the 4th call, she was fully awake and annoyed enough to snatch the phone from its charger, prepared to give whoever was calling this early a piece of her mind. Karen Martinez speaking. Is this the woman who told a little girl not to speak Spanish? The voice was young, angry, and completely unfamiliar. Who is this? How did you get this number? Your information is all over the internet, lady. You're famous now. The call ended abruptly, leaving Karen staring at her phone in confusion. Before she could process what had just happened, it rang again. This time she let it go to voicemail. Then again, then again. Within 10 minutes, she had 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Karen stumbled to her home office and opened her laptop, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for it to boot up. When she opened her browser, the first thing she saw was a Google alert notification. She'd set one up years ago to monitor any online mentions of her name for professional reasons. The alert showed 47 new results. Her stomach dropped as she clicked the first link, which took her to a TikTok video with over 800,000 views. The thumbnail showed her own face, red with anger, pointing her finger at Elena Rodriguez while Sophia cowered behind her mother. The caption read, "Racist Karen tells pregnant Latina not to speak Spanish in America, threatens family over legal pool. This is what entitlement looks like. Hashtag Karen got caught, hashtag pull permit Karen, hashtag racist Karen." Karen watched in horror as her confrontation with Elena played out on screen, but the video told a story she didn't recognize. In her memory, she had been the reasonable one, trying to address legitimate concerns about neighborhood standards. But the video showed something else entirely, a middle-aged white woman berating a pregnant Latina woman and her child, making racist demands about language use, and threatening legal action over a perfectly legal swimming pool. The comment section was a tsunami of outrage. This Karen really said speak English to a child in her own yard skull. Pull permit Karen thinks she owns the whole neighborhood. The audacity of this racist woman is unbelievable. Someone needs to check if her permits are up to date. This is exactly why people hate Karens. Karen's hand shook as she scrolled through hundreds of comments, each one feeling like a personal attack. But it got worse. The video had been shared to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. Each platform had added its own layer of commentary and analysis, picking apart every word she'd said, every expression on her face. On Twitter, hashtag PullPermitKaren was trending. On Reddit, someone had created a thread titled Pull Permit Karen, a masterclass in how not to be a neighbor, which had generated over 3,000 comments in less than 12 hours. On Facebook, the video had been shared in dozens of community groups, including 3 different Karen watch pages that specialized in documenting entitled behavior. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Someone had done research. A Twitter user named it Neighborhood Watch had created a thread that read, "Let's talk about Pull Permit Karen's expertise." She claims 20+ years of pull permit experience, but public records show something interesting. The thread included screenshots of property records showing that Karen had only lived at her previous address for 7 years, not 20. It showed that her previous pool had been an above-ground model similar to the Rodriguez family's. Most damaging of all, it included a photo of the permit she'd shown to the city supervisor, with a clear timestamp showing it was from 2003 and a different address entirely. So Pull Permit Karen has been lying about her expertise and tried to use a 20-year-old expired permit from a different house to harass her neighbors. The entitled audacity is breathtaking. Karen's phone had stopped ringing, but now her doorbell was chiming. She crept to the front window and peered through the blinds to see a news van parked on the street. A reporter was standing on her front porch, camera crew behind her, finger poised over the doorbell for another ring. Channel 7 News. The station she'd called yesterday to tell her side of the story. Karen had left a voicemail for their investigative reporter, explaining that she was a concerned citizen trying to address code violations in her neighborhood, and that she had documentation proving her expertise in pool regulations. She'd expected them to call her back so she could explain how the Rodriguez family was violating neighborhood standards. Instead, they'd apparently done their own research and decided she was the story. The doorbell rang again, followed by a knock. "Mrs. Martinez? This is Rebecca Torres from Channel 7 News. We'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to the allegations that have been made against you online." Karen pressed herself against the wall beside the window, heart pounding. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the whistleblower, the concerned citizen exposing violations. Instead, she'd somehow become the villain in a story being consumed by millions of strangers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your behavior is disgusting. People like you are what's wrong with America." Then another, "Racist trash. You should be ashamed." And another, "Saw your video. You're pathetic." The messages kept coming, dozens of them, each one cutting deeper than the last. Karen had never experienced anything like this level of public scrutiny and condemnation. At her previous job, at her old neighborhood, she'd been respected. People had listened to her concerns and taken her opinions seriously. Now she was a meme, a cautionary tale, the face of everything the internet loved to hate. Meanwhile, 3 houses down, Elena Rodriguez was discovering that viral fame came with its own complications. Her phone had been ringing all morning with interview requests from news stations, podcast hosts, and social media influencers who wanted to hear her side of the story. "Miguel, I don't know what to do," she said to her husband, who had taken the day off work after seeing the video. "People are calling me a hero for standing up to her, but I just wanted her to leave us alone." Sophia was home from day camp, confused by all the attention but excited that her family's pool had somehow made them famous. She didn't fully understand the racist implications of Karen's comments, but she could sense the tension that had settled over their normally peaceful home. "Mommy, why did the mean lady say I couldn't speak Spanish? Abuela taught me Spanish." Elena knelt down to her daughter's level, choosing her words carefully. "Some people think there's only one right way to be American, mija. But they're wrong. Speaking Spanish doesn't make us less American. It makes us who we are." Miguel was reading the comments on the video, his expression growing darker with each racist response that supported Karen's position. For every 10 people defending his family, there was one who agreed that immigrants should assimilate and respect American customs. "Elena, maybe we should talk to one of these reporters. Tell our side properly. I don't want Sophia to be part of this circus. She's already been through enough." But the circus was coming to them whether they wanted it or not. By noon, 3 more news vans had arrived on Maple Street. Reporters were knocking on doors, asking neighbors for their opinions about the pool permit Karen situation. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman across the street, told Channel 12 News, "That woman has been nothing but trouble since she moved here. Always complaining, always trying to tell people what to do. The Rodriguez family are wonderful neighbors." Harold Whitfield, the HOA president, found himself reluctantly defending the association's position. "We've investigated Mrs. Martinez's complaints thoroughly. The pool meets all our requirements. This appears to be a personal dispute that has, unfortunately, gotten out of hand." But the most damaging interview came from Karen's former neighbor at her previous address. Jennifer Walsh had lived next door to Karen for 3 years and had her own stories to tell. "She did the same thing there," Jennifer told the Channel 7 reporter. "Constant complaints, always threatening to call the city, always acting like she was in charge of the whole neighborhood. She filed noise complaints about our kids playing in the yard during the day. She tried to get our fence torn down because she said it was 2 inches over the property line. The woman is obsessed with controlling other people." Back in her house, Karen watched the interview with growing horror. Jennifer Walsh was supposed to be someone who understood her commitment to neighborhood standards. Instead, she was portraying Karen as an unstable busybody who harassed her neighbors. The worst part was that Karen could see how her behavior might look to outsiders. Stripped of context, removed from her perspective as someone trying to maintain community standards, her actions seemed petty and cruel. But she hadn't meant to be cruel. She'd meant to be responsible. Her phone rang again. This time it was her sister Margaret calling from Phoenix. "Karen, what the hell is going on? My daughter just sent me a video of you yelling at some pregnant woman. She says you're all over the internet." "Maggie, it's not what it looks like. I was trying to address legitimate code violations, and the whole thing got blown out of proportion." "Code violations? Karen, you told a little girl not to." By Thursday morning, Karen Martinez's life had become unrecognizable. She'd unplugged her landline after the 15th call from strangers hurling insults, but her cell phone continued to buzz with notifications she was afraid to read. The news. Vans had multiplied overnight. 6 vehicles now lined Maple Street like a caravan of judgment, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical accusers. Karen hadn't left her house in 24 hours. She'd called in sick too. Her job at Henderson Insurance, where she worked as a claims adjuster, claiming a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. This certainly felt like an emergency, and the destruction of her reputation was definitely a family matter now that Margaret wouldn't return her calls. From behind her living room curtains, she watched Elena Rodriguez emerge from her house for the first time since the video went viral. The pregnant woman moved slowly, one hand supporting her lower back as she walked to her mailbox. Immediately, reporters swarmed like vultures, microphones thrust toward her face, cameras capturing every expression. Mrs. Rodriguez, how do you feel about becoming a symbol of resistance against neighborhood harassment? Elena, what message do you have for other families facing similar discrimination? Can you comment on the investigation into Karen Martinez's complaint history? Elena raised one hand, her voice barely audible from Karen's window. Please, I just want to get my mail. My family wants privacy right now. But privacy was a luxury none of them possessed anymore. The story had evolved beyond a simple neighborhood dispute into a cultural lightning rod that revealed deep fractures in American society. Social media users had turned it into a case study of privilege, racism, and the weaponization of authority against minorities. More damaging still, investigative journalists had begun digging into Karen's past with the thoroughness of forensic accountants. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who had made harassment her hobby across multiple neighborhoods and 2 decades. Karen's phone buzzed with a call from her supervisor at Henderson Insurance. Karen, this is Bob. We need to talk. Bob Henderson was a man who had hired Karen 3 years ago based on her attention to detail and her ability to identify fraudulent claims. Those same skills, it turned out, had made her exceptionally effective at tormenting her neighbors. Bob, I can explain. Karen, I've got reporters calling the office asking about your employment here. I've got clients asking if you're the woman from the video. This morning I had to explain to my biggest client why our claims adjuster is trending on Twitter as Pull Permit Karen. Karen's stomach clenched. Her job was the one stable thing in her life, the source of the income that allowed her to afford her mortgage and maintain her position in the neighborhood hierarchy. This is a personal matter that has nothing to do with my work performance. A personal matter? Karen, you're on video making racist comments to a child. You presented fake documentation to city officials. The internet is calling you a liar and a racist, and our company name is getting dragged into it because people are identifying you as our employee. I never presented fake documentation. I showed them my pull permit to establish my expertise. A 20-year-old permit from a different address? Karen, that's exactly the kind of fraudulent misrepresentation we investigate other people for. How does that look for an insurance company? The call ended with Karen placed on administrative leave pending a review of the situation. She was to remain at home, avoid media contact, and await further instructions about her employment status. As if on cue, her doorbell rang. Karen peered through the blinds to see a man in his 50s wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a briefcase. He didn't look like a reporter, but she'd learned not to trust appearances. Mrs. Martinez, my name is Detective Ray Morrison with the City Police Department. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your recent interactions with city officials. Karen's blood turned to ice. Police involvement meant this had moved beyond viral embarrassment into potential legal consequences. She opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock engaged. What kind of questions? We've received a complaint alleging that you presented fraudulent documentation to the City Planning Department. We'd like to give you an opportunity to explain the circumstances. The fraudulent documentation. Her 2003 pull permit, the piece of evidence that was supposed to establish her credibility, had become the weapon being used against her. Someone, probably that David Chen from planning, had reported her to the police for misrepresenting her qualifications. I didn't present fraudulent documentation. I showed them proof of my experience with pull permits. May I come in? This would be easier to discuss privately. Karen reluctantly unlatched the chain and allowed Detective Morrison into her living room. He was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who had dealt with hundreds of similar cases, people whose good intentions had led them into legal trouble through poor judgment and escalating behavior. Mrs. Martinez, I want to be clear that no charges have been filed at this time. But presenting an expired permit from a different property as evidence of current expertise could be construed as misrepresentation to government officials. That's a serious matter. I never said it was a current permit. I said I had experience with pull permits. Detective Morrison pulled out a small recorder. Do you mind if I record our conversation? It protects both of us. Karen nodded, though every instinct screamed that she should call a lawyer. But lawyers cost money, and lawyers meant acknowledging that she'd done something legally wrong rather than just socially awkward. Mrs. Martinez, can you tell me about your interactions with David Chen at the planning department? Karen recounted the meeting, emphasizing her genuine concerns about neighborhood safety and her legitimate expertise as a former pool owner. But even as she spoke, she could hear how her story sounded, like someone desperately trying to justify behavior that had spiraled out of control. And the permit you showed Mr. Chen, where did that come from? It was my permit from my previous house. I kept it in my files because I'm organized about that kind of documentation. But you presented it as evidence of your qualifications to assess the Rodriguez pool installation. I presented it as proof that I understood the permit process. Detective Morrison made notes as she spoke, his expression professionally neutral. Karen had no way of knowing that he'd already spoken with David Chen, Elena Rodriguez, and 3 of her former neighbors who had filed their own complaints about her behavior over the years. The picture emerging was of a woman who used quasi-legal authority to intimidate people she disagreed with, who escalated minor disputes into official complaints, and who had a pattern of presenting herself as more knowledgeable and more entitled to control neighborhood affairs than she actually was. Mrs. Martinez, I have to ask, have you been in contact with any reporters about this situation? I called Channel 7 yesterday to explain my side of the story, but they never called me back. What Karen didn't know was that Channel 7 had indeed investigated her claims and had discovered enough contradictions and fabrications to build an entire investigative report around her pattern of deceptive behavior. The story was scheduled to air that evening during the 6 p.m. news. After Detective Morrison left, Karen found herself alone with the magnitude of what she'd unleashed. The viral video had been bad enough, but now there were potential legal consequences, employment consequences, and social consequences that extended far beyond her neighborhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from Harold Whitfield, the HOA president. Karen, I need to inform you that the board is calling an emergency meeting to discuss your conduct. Multiple neighbors have filed formal complaints, and we may need to take action to protect the association from liability. Even the homeowners association, the organization that was supposed to protect property values and maintain neighborhood standards, was turning against her. The very system she'd believed supported her authority was now questioning her right to wield it. Outside, the circus continued. Elena Rodriguez had finally agreed to a single interview with Channel 12 News, speaking calmly and thoughtfully about the impact of discrimination on her family while standing beside the pool that had started everything. We didn't ask for this attention, Elena said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. We just wanted to give our daughter a place to swim during the summer. But if our story helps other families recognize harassment and stand up for themselves, then something good came from something painful. The reporter asked about Karen's claims of pool permit expertise. I never understood why she thought having a pool 20 years ago at a different house made her an expert on our pool, Elena replied. It felt like she was just looking for reasons to justify her behavior. Miguel stood beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders. The hardest part was explaining to Sophia why someone would tell her not to speak Spanish. That's her heritage, her connection to her grandmother. No one has the right to take that away from a child. The interview was respectful, dignified, and devastating in its contrast to Karen's behavior. Where Karen had been shrill and demanding, Elena was calm and reasonable. Where Karen had made threats and presented dubious documentation, the Rodriguez family had simply tried to live their lives. Friday morning arrived with the kind of scorching heat that made the asphalt shimmer and sent sensible people running for air conditioning. But Karen Martinez barely noticed the temperature as she stood at her kitchen window, watching the aftermath of her own destruction unfold on Maple Street. The news vans had finally departed, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. The story had moved beyond breaking news into the realm of lasting consequence, where real lives were permanently altered by moments of poor judgment captured on video. Karen's phone sat silent on the counter. She'd finally turned off all notifications. After receiving over 3,000 messages, 90% of which ranged from disappointed to vitriolic. Her email inbox showed 847 unread messages. Her social media accounts, which she'd hastily deleted, continued to be tagged in posts she couldn't stop and comments she couldn't control. At 9 a.m. sharp, her doorbell rang with the mechanical precision of someone keeping an appointment. Karen already knew who it would be. The certified letter had arrived yesterday, informing her that representatives from Henderson Insurance would be conducting a final employment review at her residence. Bob Henderson stood on her porch alongside a woman Karen didn't recognize, both carrying briefcases and wearing the grim expressions of people delivering news no one wanted to hear. "Karen, this is Linda Morrison from our HR department. May we come in?" Karen led them to her living room, the same space where Detective Morrison had questioned her about fraudulent documentation, where she'd watched her life unravel on live television, where she'd finally understood that her 20 years of neighborhood authority had been an illusion built on other people's reluctance to confront her. "Karen," Bob began without preamble, "Henderson Insurance has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she'd been expecting them since Tuesday's phone call. "Bob, this is a personal matter that has nothing to do with my job performance. You can't fire me for something that happened in my own neighborhood." Linda Morrison opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. "Mrs. Martinez, our investigation revealed that your behavior toward the Rodriguez family is part of a pattern that directly contradicts our company values and poses a liability. Risk to our organization." "What investigation?" "After the video went viral, we received calls from several former clients who recognized you. They alleged similar behavior during claim investigations, accusations of fraud without evidence, threats to escalate matters to authorities, attempts to intimidate claimants who didn't meet your personal standards of appropriate behavior." Karen's stomach dropped. Her work persona and her neighborhood persona were supposed to be separate, but the same controlling instincts that made her effective at spotting insurance fraud had also made her a nightmare neighbor. The skills were identical, only the context had changed. "Additionally," Linda continued, "your presentation of a 20-year-old expired permit as evidence of expertise demonstrates exactly the kind of fraudulent misrepresentation we investigate in others. We cannot employ someone who engages in the same deceptive practices we are paid to identify and prevent." Bob leaned forward, his expression mixing disappointment with something that might have been pity. "Karen, I hired you because I thought you had good judgment about people's character. But this whole situation shows that your judgment was clouded by personal bias and prejudice. That's not someone we can trust to handle sensitive claim investigations." The termination paperwork was comprehensive and final. 2-week severance pay, immediate revocation of her access to company systems, and a recommendation that she seek professional counseling to address patterns of inappropriate behavior toward others. After they left, Karen sat alone in her living room, processing the magnitude of her losses. Her job, her reputation, her standing in the community, her sense of herself as someone whose opinions mattered, all of it had evaporated in less than a week because she decided that a family's legal pool violated her personal vision of neighborhood order. Outside, life on Maple Street was returning to its normal rhythm, but with a new dynamic that excluded Karen entirely. Elena Rodriguez was back to her routine of morning walks, though neighbors now stopped to check on her and offer support. Sophia was playing in the pool with 2 new friends from down the street, children whose parents had reached out after seeing the video, wanting to show solidarity with the family that had been targeted. Miguel had returned to work, but his experience had changed him. The support from strangers around the world had been overwhelming, but so had the racist responses from people who agreed with Karen's position. He'd learned that his family's American dream was still considered conditional by people who looked like Karen Martinez. The most unexpected development was a GoFundMe campaign started by someone in California who had seen the viral video. Support. The Rodriguez Family Pool Fund had raised $127,000 from people who wanted to help offset any legal costs and show that kindness outnumbered hatred. The family had decided to donate most of the money to legal aid organizations that helped immigrant families facing harassment. At 2 p.m., Karen's doorbell rang again. This time it was Harold Whitfield, the HOA president, carrying an official envelope sealed with the association's logo. "Karen, I'm sorry to deliver this in person, but the board felt you deserved the courtesy of face-to-face notification." The letter inside was brief and devastating. The Homeowners Association was fining her $5,000 for conduct detrimental to community harmony and requiring her to attend mediation with the Rodriguez family or face additional penalties, including potential litigation to force the sale of her property. "Harold, this is outrageous. I was trying to protect property values and enforce community standards." Harold Whitfield had known Karen for 3 years, had listened to her complaints and theories and demands for action. He'd initially seen her as an engaged resident who cared about the neighborhood. But the viral video had forced him to reevaluate every interaction they'd ever had. Karen, protecting property values doesn't mean harassing pregnant women. Enforcing community standards doesn't mean telling children they can't speak their heritage language. And it certainly doesn't mean filing false complaints based on expired permits from different addresses. I never filed false complaints. You told city officials you had 20 years of pool permit experience. You had 7 years with one pool. You presented a permit from 2003 as evidence of your expertise in 2025. Karen, that's not mistaken, that's deceptive. Harold's words carried the weight of someone who had finally recognized manipulation for what it was. The board voted unanimously. This isn't about the pool anymore. This is about a pattern of behavior that has made multiple families uncomfortable in their own homes. After Harold left, Karen found herself confronting the possibility that she would have to sell her house, the symbol of her success, her stake in the community, her right to have opinions about how neighbors should behave. The American dream she'd worked 20 years to achieve was crumbling because she tried to deny that same dream to a family whose only crime was speaking Spanish and owning a pool. As the afternoon heat peaked, Karen made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. She walked across her yard to the fence that separated her property from the Rodriguez families and called Elena's name. Elena emerged from her kitchen, moving slowly in the oppressive heat, her pregnancy now visibly nearing its end. When she saw Karen at the fence, her expression hardened with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust her neighbors. Motives. What do you want, Karen? I want to apologize. This whole thing got out of hand, and I said things I didn't mean. I was frustrated, and I took it out on your family. Elena studied Karen's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse. What she saw instead was someone apologizing for the consequences of her actions rather than the actions themselves. You told my 8-year-old daughter not to speak Spanish in her own yard, Karen. You told her this is America, like speaking her grandmother's language made her less American than you. That wasn't frustration, that was racism. I'm not racist. I just believe in assimilation and community standards. Community standards that don't apply to white families? Standards that somehow don't require you to be honest about your qualifications or respectful to your neighbors. Karen realized that even in her apology, she was defending her position rather than acknowledging its impact. She had become so invested in being right that she couldn't recognize when she was wrong. Elena, I know we can't be friends, but could we at least be civil neighbors? For the sake of the community. Elena's answer was delivered with the quiet dignity that had made her a symbol of grace under pressure for millions of strangers who had watched her story unfold. Karen, you've spent 3 years trying to make my family feel unwelcome in our own home. You've filed false complaints, made racist comments, and presented fraudulent documentation to government officials. Civil neighbors don't do those things. She paused, one hand supporting her lower back, the other resting on her pregnant belly. I hope you find a way to be happy that doesn't require controlling other people. But my family's peace is more important than your comfort, and I won't pretend.